अस्सलाम वालेकुम स्टूडेंट्स। आज का जो हमारा टॉपिक है 11th क्लास के लिए हमने बिजनेस स्टडीज से सिलेक्ट किया है, दैट इज़ क्लासिफिकेशन ऑफ सोर्सेज ऑफ फंड्स। यानी कि जो अलग अलग सोर्सेज हैं फंड्स के, उनको क्लासिफाई किया गया है। The various sources of funds can be classified on the basis of first one, that is period basis, ownership basis and source of generation basis। तो पहले हम डिस्कस करेंगे ये जो पीरियड बेसिस है, इस बुनियाद पे जो फंड्स को क्लासिफाई किया गया है, तो कौन कौन से फंड्स पीरियड बेसिस में आ जाते हैं। The different sources of funds on the basis of period can be classified into three parts. First one, that is long term sources, second one, that is medium term sources, and last one, that is the short term sources. Let me discuss them one by one. First one, that is long term sources. It includes those sources which are required by the business firm for a period exceeding 5 years. For example, shares, debentures, long-term borrowings and loans usually required for the acquisition of fixed assets such as plant and machinery, equipment, furniture, etc. तो मीडियम टर्म हम किसको कहेंगे? It includes those sources which are required for a period of more than a year but less than 5 years. For example, borrowings from commercial banks, public depositors, lease financing and loans from financial institutions. Third one, that is the short term sources. It includes those sources which are required by business firm for a period of less than 1 year. For example, trade credit, loans from commercial banks, commercial papers, etc. These sources are required for financing current assets such as accounts, receivables and inventories. ये तो था पीरियड बेसिस पे जो सोर्स ऑफ फंड्स हैं उनको क्लासिफाई किया गया था। अब हम ओनरशिप बेसिस पे जो सोर्स ऑफ फंड्स हैं उनको क्लासिफाई करेंगे, उनमें कौन कौन से फंड्स आ जाते हैं। Let me discuss on the basis of ownership. The various sources of finance can be classified into owners funds and borrowed funds. First one, that is owners funds. The funds provided by the owner of an enterprise are known as owners funds. Such funds not only include capital contribution contributed by the owner but also profits reinvested in the business. These funds remain invested in the business for a longer period of time and not refunded during the life of the business. For example, equity shares, retained earnings, etc. Second one, that is borrowed funds. The funds raised through loans or borrowings are known as borrowed funds. Loans from commercial banks and financial institutions, trade credit, issue of debentures, public deposits, etc. are the main sources for raising borrowed funds. These funds are for a specified period and have to be repaid after the expiry of that period. Usually these funds are obtained on the security of some fixed assets and also a fixed rate of interest is to be paid on them. Sometimes these funds put a lot of burden on the business because the business firms are liable to pay the interest anyway, regardless of whether they make profit or loss. Sources of generation basis. Source of generation basis. It includes internal and external sources of funds. ये जो जनरेशन बेसिस पे आ जाता है इसमें भी टू टाइप्स होती हैं. एक हो गया इंटरनल सोर्सेज ऑफ फंड्स, दूसरा हो गया एक्सटर्नल सोर्सेज ऑफ फंड्स. The sources of first one, that is internal source of funds. The sources of funds which are generated by the business itself are known as internal sources of funds. For example, collection of receivables, disposing of surplus inventories, plowing back of profits. Only limited needs of the business are fulfilled by these sources. Last one, that is external sources of funds. The sources of funds that lie outside an organization are known as external sources of funds. For example, loans from commercial banks and financial institutions, issue of debentures, public deposits, lease financing, trade credit, factoring, etc. Requirement of large amount of funds can be fulfilled by these sources. The funds raised through these sources are costly as compared to the funds raised through internal sources. Sometimes the business firms have to even mortgage their assets as security while raising funds from these sources. Let me repeat here: source of generation basis, that is of two types: internal source of funds and external source of funds. The sources of funds which are generated by the business itself are known as internal sources of funds. For example, collection of receivables, disposing of surplus inventories, plowing back of profits. Only limited needs of the business are fulfilled by these sources because they are limited. Second one, that is external sources of funds. The sources of funds that lie outside an organization are known as external sources of funds. For example, loans from commercial banks and financial institutions, issue of debentures, public depositors, lease financing, trade credit, factoring, etc. Requirement of large amount of funds can be fulfilled by these sources. The funds raised through these sources are costly as compared to the funds raised through internal sources. Sometimes the business firms have to even mortgage their assets as security while raising funds from these sources.